Queens and Consorts of England. Part 5. The Tudors. The lives of the many kings and handful of Queens Regnant who have held dominion over the Kingdom of England, and later the United Kingdom, take center stage in history. But the lives of their spouses and mothers are often relegated to the wings. In this series, we will learn the stories of the many Queens Consort and the handful of male consorts who have been at the monarch's sides. Through love, hate, adultery, and sometimes murder, these women and men have played vital roles in the history of England. For 30 years, the Lancaster and York branches of the royal family battled over the throne in the Wars of the Roses. And while the two sides couldn't agree on much, they did see eye to eye on one thing. Nobody liked Richard III. Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville of the Yorkists and Lady Margaret Beaufort of the Lancastrians made a pact to unite their families through the marriage of their children. And together they defeated Richard, who was killed in the Battle of Bosworth Field. The crown was found under a bush and placed on the head of Margaret's son, now King Henry VII. By his side was Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York. She was the daughter of King Edward IV, the sister of King Edward V, the niece of King Richard III, the wife of King Henry VII, and the mother of King Henry VIII. At 9, she was briefly betrothed to the future King Charles VIII of France, but the treaty was called off. When her father died and her brothers were murdered by their uncle, Elizabeth, as the eldest daughter, had a strong claim to the throne. At 20, she married the newly crowned King Henry VII and relinquished her claim to him. He took as his emblem a combination of his Lancastrian red rose and her Yorkist white rose. The political marriage ended up being a rather happy union of mutual attraction and respect. Elizabeth was a loving mother. She ensured her children had an excellent education and spent as much time with them as her royal duties would allow. As she had grown up at the English court while her upstart husband had grown up on the run in France, Elizabeth was a great asset when it came to the softer side of politics. She knew how a king and queen must present themselves, how to host foreign dignitaries, and how to keep courtiers happy. Elizabeth enjoyed music, dancing, gambling, and kept greyhounds. She was especially fond of Christmas, which the family celebrated with great feasts and frivolity. Queen Elizabeth was well loved by the people and gave generously to charity, in contrast with her famously miserly husband. The couple's eldest son, 15-year-old Arthur, married Catherine of Aragon, and the newlyweds moved to Ludlow Castle in Wales. While there, Arthur died of the sweating sickness. The broken-hearted parents had just lost their baby son Edmund to the plague, and with only one living male heir left, Prince Henry, the royal couple hoped to have another baby boy to secure the fledgling Tudor dynasty. Soon enough, Elizabeth became pregnant, but the baby, a daughter, died a few days after birth, and Elizabeth died of childbed fever on February 11th, her 37th birthday. Her husband and children were devastated at the loss. This illuminated manuscript shows 11-year-old Prince Henry weeping into the sheets of his mother's empty bed. King Henry was encouraged to take a second wife, but no other woman could ever measure up to his late queen. He died a widower, making way for his son, the most infamous royal husband in history, Henry VIII. Henry had 6 queens during his 36-year reign. These fascinating women and the paths that took them into Henry's life and out of it, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, could easily be their own videos. And in fact, I've made a 2-part series going into further detail about each of their lives. But to keep this video from becoming a feature-length film, I'll just briefly introduce you to them here. Catherine of Aragon was the youngest child of Spanish power couple Isabel I of Castile and Fernando II of Aragon. She was first wed to Henry VII's eldest son and heir, Arthur, but when he died a few months after the wedding, Catherine was stuck in England with no money while her father and father-in-law fought over her dowry. Clever Catherine represented her own case to the English king and was the first female ambassador in Europe. When Henry VII died and his second son became Henry VIII, the handsome and athletic 18-year-old married his beautiful and worldly 23-year-old sister-in-law. Right away, Catherine became pregnant, but she suffered several miscarriages, and her only son, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, died at just 52 days old. Henry appointed Catherine regent while he went to war with France, and while he was away, King James IV of Scotland invaded England. Catherine, heavily pregnant, rode north to defeat the Scots, but she went into premature labor and delivered another stillborn baby. She had only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Being only the second Tudor king, Henry was obsessed with fathering a son to secure his dynasty. When Catherine entered menopause, Henry decided to divorce her. He had a replacement all picked out, a lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn, the daughter of the English ambassador to France. Anne was from a minor noble house. She wasn't considered especially beautiful, but she had grown up on the continent and possessed abundant style and sophistication. Her charming and dazzling personality enchanted the king. She and Henry shared a love of hunting, dancing, and playing music. At first, she resisted the king's advances. She hoped to marry a gentleman of her own status, rather than become yet another royal mistress, as so many ladies, including her own sister, had. But her rejection only fueled Henry's ardor, and eventually she relented and agreed to sleep with him if he would marry her first. This would require Henry obtaining a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He appealed to the Pope for an annulment on the grounds of incest, as Catherine had been married to his older brother first. But Catherine swore in court that she had never slept with Arthur, and the Pope refused to grant Henry's request. Outraged, the king used the Protestant movement to make himself head of the new Church of England. He dissolved the monasteries and enriched himself by looting their wealth, and he granted himself a divorce. Catherine of Aragon, a devout Catholic, was horrified. As punishment for defying her royal spouse, Henry forbade his ex-wife from seeing their daughter Mary. Catherine died alone and miserable at the age of 50. Now Queen Anne bore a child, but to Henry's disappointment, it was a daughter, Elizabeth. Anne miscarried their second child. Increasing strife in the marriage, partly due to Anne's refusal to ignore the king's philandering, caused Henry to resent her. Her enemies accused her of adultery and incest with her brother, crimes of which she was certainly innocent. But nonetheless, she was beheaded at the Tower of London. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour, who, like Anne, was an English lady-in-waiting who had rebuffed the king's invitation to his bed. But it seemed Henry couldn't take no for an answer. She was far less educated and more demure than the king's previous wives, and she came from a large family, so he was sure that she would provide him with a brood of healthy sons. But just in case, he put off her coronation until after their first child was born. And it was a boy, the long-awaited Prince Edward. Jane never got her coronation, however, as she died of childbed fever 12 days after the birth. Next, Henry was encouraged to make a political marriage and add a spare to the nursery of the heir. Unsurprisingly, princesses were not lining up to marry the wife-murdering monarch. One said if she had 2 heads, she'd be happy to marry him. A treaty was finally made for the hand of Anne of Cleves, sister of a German elector. Henry became infatuated with this portrait of her. When she landed in England, Henry decided to surprise her by disguising himself as a peasant, being sure that she would fall in love with him on sight, like in the romantic stories of the troubadours. But when Anne was shocked rather than enamored with the old, overweight stranger who burst in on her, Henry was humiliated. He complained that it was Anne who was ugly, and thus he was unable to consummate the marriage. Anne was happy to accept a divorce, a generous settlement and estates, and to escape with her head. She spent the rest of her life in England, where she was welcomed at court as the king's sister. 50-year-old Henry quickly healed his broken heart with 16-year-old Catherine Howard, a cousin of Anne Boleyn. Her uncle put her in Henry's line of vision in the hopes of gaining wealth and power for himself. In the final months of his marriage to Anne of Cleves, the king was frequently seen entering Lady Howard's bedchamber. For a year, Henry doted on his beautiful teenage wife, fulfilling her desire for clothes and jewelry. While Henry was besotted, Catherine was being blackmailed by a former confidant who knew that she was not a virgin, having been molested by her music teacher years earlier. Worse, she was actively carrying out a love affair with the king's favorite courtier. When news of the queen's adultery reached the king, he was devastated and refused to see her again. She was even more devastated when she was sentenced to death and beheaded in the Tower of London. After 5 matrimonial disasters, you'd think Henry might remain single, but the aging king was lonely, so he married 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. There was no question of her virginity, as she had already been twice widowed. She had fallen in love with courtier Thomas Seymour, the brother of Queen Jane Seymour, and the pair planned to wed. But when the king set his sights on her, she had little choice but to accept his proposal. She was a companion and nurse for the ailing old king, as well as a published author, a remarkable feat for a woman of the time. She got herself into hot water by arguing with the king on the topic of religion. Catherine was able to convince hot-tempered Henry moments before guards arrived to arrest her that she was only debating His Majesty in order to learn from his instruction. Henry's failing health finally gave out at 55. Catherine Parr and Anne of Cleves were the only wives to survive him. After 3 marriages to ailing old men, Catherine finally married the man of her dreams, Thomas Seymour. But he turned out to be a scoundrel and tried to seduce her stepdaughter, Princess Elizabeth. Catherine died at 36, giving birth to her only child. Henry's son became King Edward VI at the age of 9. 3 years earlier, he had been betrothed to the 7-month-old Mary, who became Queen of Scots when her father died just 6 days after her birth. But when the Scots reneged on the treaty and instead betrothed the baby queen to the Dauphin of France, Henry VIII was furious. He responded with the most savage campaign ever launched against Scotland, which became known as the Rough Wooing. As king, Edward VI still held out hope that he might win Queen Mary, thus uniting England and Scotland. And with no brothers, Edward was under a great deal of pressure to marry and produce a Protestant heir. He lived in fear that his older sister Mary would return the country to Catholicism if she ever got the chance. At age 15, King Edward fell fatally ill with tuberculosis, and he signed a new succession act, skipping over both of his sisters and naming his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir. Her husband and disputed King Consort of England was Guildford Dudley, one of 13 children of the Duke of Northumberland, chief counselor who ruled England on behalf of the underage king. When it became clear that King Edward would die, it was Northumberland who pushed for the 16-year-old Jane Grey to be named heir, and he hastily married her to his 18-year-old son, Guildford. His intention was to continue ruling England, using the new queen and king as his puppets. The couple were wed in a ceremony fit for a king and queen, with jousts, masks, and the attendance of foreign ambassadors. 2 months later, Edward VI died, and Jane and Guildford rode triumphantly into London to claim the throne. Jane was only the second Queen Regnant in English history, and Guildford pressured her to name him king. When Jane refused, he refused to sleep with her and threatened to leave. Word quickly arrived that Mary was raising an army to march on London and take back her birthright. As Jane grew increasingly distraught about the dangerous position she had been pushed into, Guildford put on airs and dressed as a king. He presided over council meetings and dined in state alone. Jane was only on the throne for 9 days when Mary arrived with her army. Northumberland abandoned Jane and his son Guildford, who were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. During their 7-month incarceration, the newlyweds were kept apart. Guildford carved his wife's name into his cell wall. Queen Mary recognized that Jane had been a political pawn and did not wish to execute her cousin. But when a rebellion in Jane's favor frightened Mary's betrothed from coming to England, she signed the death warrant. Guildford requested to see Jane one last time, but she refused, answering back that it would only increase their misery and pain, and that they would shortly meet again in the afterlife. The 16-year-old, 9 days queen watched from the window as her husband was led to the scaffold, where many gentlemen waited to shake the hand of the erstwhile king consort. When the axe struck him, she exclaimed, "O Guildford, Guildford!" She herself was dead within the hour, and her body hastily laid next to his in the Tower Chapel. While her mother, Catherine of Aragon, had been queen, young Princess Mary had been betrothed to both the Dauphin of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. But during her many years out of her father's favor, she was not seen as a worthy bride for any foreign royals, and she remained unmarried. Once queen, Mary, now 37, was eager to wed and bear a Catholic heir who might keep the throne out of the hands of her Protestant younger sister, Elizabeth. Mary's former fiancé, Emperor Charles V, suggested that she marry his son, Philip II of Spain, who had been raised in Castile by his mother, Isabella of Portugal. Both of his parents were cousins to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. They were Habsburgs, after all. Emperor Charles, who spent most of his time in Germany, visited his son at 16 and was so impressed that he made him regent of the Spanish Empire. Philip, who became known as the Prudent, had an excellent mind for statecraft and conquest. He took the already vast empire to its heights, with territories on every continent then known to Europeans. The Philippines were named in his honor. Philip's first wife was his double first cousin, Maria Manuela of Portugal. They were both 16 when they wed, but she died just 1 year later, giving birth to their son, Carlos, who, due to inbreeding, suffered severe mental health problems and died at the age of 23. Philip was 26 when he began marriage negotiations with Queen Mary. Their union was incredibly unpopular in England. Whether or not a Queen Regnant's husband should be king was unclear. According to English law, a wife's possessions and titles rightly belonged to her husband, and the English did not want to be swallowed up by the vast Habsburg Empire. But Mary became infatuated with her dashing cousin's portrait, so ignored the outrage of her people and invited him to England. She wasn't disappointed when they finally met in person, and she fell desperately in love with him. Philip did not return her affection, and saw the marriage as purely political. Upon their marriage, Philip was declared king and co-regent of England, and coins were minted with both of their faces. Mary went to work undoing her father and brother's efforts to convert the nation to Protestantism. She became known as Bloody Mary by burning 280 Protestants at the stake. 2 months into her marriage, Mary began to exhibit signs of pregnancy. But as the 10th and 11th months ticked by with no signs of labor, the Queen's swollen belly began to recede. She probably suffered a combination of a tumor and a psychosomatic episode. Following the humiliation of her false pregnancy, Philip returned to the continent and Mary was heartbroken. He stayed away for 2 years, during which time his father abdicated and he was named King of Spain, though the Holy Roman Empire went to his uncle, Ferdinand I. Philip returned to England once more to ask his wife for funds and troops for his war with France. Lovesick Mary was willing to give Philip whatever he wanted, but her council refused to send English soldiers to die in a foreign war. After Philip left, Mary once more believed that she was pregnant, but again no baby arrived. Queen Mary died the following year of uterine cancer at the age of 42. Philip wrote to his sister, "I felt a reasonable regret for her death." Before Mary was even dead, Philip sent a marriage proposal to her younger sister and heir Elizabeth, but was rejected. The following year, he married his third cousin, Elizabeth of Valois. She died in childbirth, and he then married his niece, Anne of Austria. Philip watched in anger as Queen Elizabeth I took the English throne and established a Protestant-leaning policy of religious tolerance. 30 years after being displaced as King of England, Philip attacked the country with the might of the Spanish Armada. But Elizabeth won an unlikely victory. Philip had to content himself with ruling the vast Spanish Empire without England, which he did for another decade before dying at 71. With her mother having been executed on her father's orders and the drama surrounding her sister's marriage, Queen Elizabeth I wisely chose to remain single. She had a long-time love affair with English nobleman Robert Dudley and rejected many foreign suitors, including King Charles IX of France, Archduke Charles of Austria, and King Eric XIV of Sweden. She reigned alone for 45 years over a golden era of peace, prosperity, and flourishing art. When she died at 67, the Virgin Queen left the throne to her cousin Mary Queen of Scots' son, King James VI of Scotland. He united England and Scotland and founded a new royal dynasty, the Stuarts. In the next chapter, we'll meet the Stuart Consorts, who indulged in art, theater, and culture. One lost her crown when her husband lost his head, and most had to look the other way while their spouses carried on with their many lovers. Don't want to wait to see the rest of this series? Patrons get exclusive early access now. If you would like to become a patron and help me make more fascinating history videos, check out the link in the description. Thank you for watching.